The first premise that Socrates is arguing for is the idea that he has to abide by the laws of Athens. This premise is based off the idea that Socrates knowingly and willingly chose to abide by the laws of Athens, as he chose to stay in the city-state and never left. At no point did he argue that the law should not apply to him before his tenure, and he has enjoyed the benefits of living in the city his whole life. However, this premise can be disputed through the consent theory of the social contract that Simmons discusses in our readings. Simmons argues that one must knowingly consent, intentionally consent, and voluntarily consent to an agreement before an agreement can be valid. In this case, the voluntary nature of Socrates' consent can be disputed. For voluntary consent, the alternative to consenting must be both reasonable and easily performed. While he did choose to spend his whole life in Athens, we would argue that the alternative to living in the city is not reasonable. By dissenting, you'd be choosing to live out in the wild, away from family, friends, food, shelter, or any other benefits of civilization. This is not a voluntary decision, as no person can reasonably choose to live in the wild when the city is the other alternative. In this way, Athens is forcing its cities to agree by the laws, with the alternative being exile and possible death. And so, Socrates should not be forced to agree to the terms, as the terms are not sound.
Socrates argues that it is unjustified to not abide by the laws of a society from which you deem yourself a citizen. A citizen, in Socrates' mind, is someone who is willingly and voluntarily lives in that particular society and understands the rules that come with residency. Therefore, the state and the individual make an agreement in order to live harmoniously and prosperously. The individual agrees to abide by the laws, and the state, on the other hand, agrees to uphold the basic rights and liberties of the individual. In a scenario where the state has held up their side of the bargain, it is imperative for the individual to hold up theirs as well. However, an agreement only exists when both sides commit to fulfilling their agreement. If one fails, then the agreement crumbles and the other party is no way forced to hold up theirs. Therefore, if a state fails to uphold the basic rights and liberties of individuals, then those citizens are not obligated to abide by the laws. In Socrates' case, the state used improper methods that infringed upon his right of free speech. Therefore, Socrates has no moral obligation to hold up his side of the agreement and stay in prison. The third premise in Socrates' argument for why it is morally wrong to escape from jail and his doomed fate is his belief that it is unethical to break an agreement. Socrates explains his reason for his belief in the importance of trust to Crito. Do you think a society can continue to exist and not be overthrown if a legal judgment rendered it to have no force, but are deprived of authority and undermined by the actions of private individuals? Socrates understands that societies and relations with other human beings are built on trust. If there is no trust, then society, and for that matter humanity, will not be able to progress. While this is a fair statement to make, it is silly to believe that this claim holds truth in every circumstance. Humans make decisions in the moment, and if there is a moment where breaking an agreement will lead to more good than bad, then it is actually moral to break that agreement. Take the man and child example. Let's say a man has an agreement to get to work at 9 every day, and he's currently running late. He encounters a kid who is wandering all alone in the streets looking for his parents. I would argue that it is morally right to stop and try to help the small kid find his parents rather than upholding to the agreement of getting to work by 9. Socrates has the right mindset in his belief that in the importance of trust, but it is naive to think that one should never break an agreement.
The fourth premise that Socrates argues for is that if Socrates chooses to escape, he breaks an agreement. Because Socrates has agreed to abide by the laws state that he should be held in jail before his trial. And so, Socrates cannot leave his prison without breaking the law. This is a fairly straightforward idea, in that once an agreement has been made, fleeing from the terms of that agreement will be violating his obligation. However, there is an argument against this fourth premise. This fourth premise is structured around the idea that fleeing a trial is in violation of the laws of the state. However, if the trial itself is unjust or corrupt, is there a purpose for Socrates to even attend if justice will not be served? This trial is based off the idea that Socrates was corrupting the youth. How do you properly define how to corrupt the youth? If the youth have voluntarily chosen to listen to Socrates' opinions, is he really to blame for their actions? Should he be held accountable for others' actions in the cities that he cannot control? And so, it can be fair for Socrates to depart from his prison, as this trial may not be a just one.
So moving on to premise 5, the premise is that Socrates ought not to escape. Essentially, the principle behind this, following from the other premises, is that it's morally wrong for Socrates to escape because he has tacitly consented to living in the Athenian system of law due to the fact that he's peacefully lived there for over 70 years of his life without protesting once, has never been denied any time or opportunity to protest the system, and therefore can be assumed reasonably so by the state that he has therefore agreed to enter into this system and cooperate. And escaping would undeniably be an act, it would not be an act of cooperation, it'd be the opposite. Another argument that you could bring up is even if Socrates escaping would break an agreement, agreements that have already been broken reflect no obligations onto either party because they've already been broken. So in theory, if Athens weren't in fact upholding its part of the bargain, then Socrates would be justified. But this is countered in the text by this quote: "You see, we gave you birth, upbringing, and education, and have provided you, as well as every other citizen, with a share of all the fine things we could." End quote. What this is saying is that Athens has, in fact, upheld its side of the bargain. It's given you access to everything that a state is supposed to give you access to, and therefore Socrates should also be obligated to uphold his side of the bargain. Arguing against premise 5, even if you have proven that it's morally wrong, or even if Socrates has proven that it's morally wrong to break an agreement, this is an example of moral absolutism. It comes into play hundreds of years later in Kantian ethics, where it becomes, or the belief is that it's morally wrong, or is not acceptable to do anything that is morally wrong under any circumstances whatsoever, even convoluted and unusual ones. But that's not the only moral view that has been written about. There's also a utilitarian view, which would say that even if it is morally wrong for him to escape, it could also be morally wrong for him to not escape. Drinking the hemlock would undoubtedly have many negative consequences that could also be constituted as things that are morally wrong. For instance, if he does not escape, his children will not have adequate care. This is something that's undeniably not good. Another thing is that he's been put on a quest communicated by the oracle to him, and if he agrees to drink the hemlock, then he will not be able to complete that task. And lastly, it's clear that the Athenian system of law is flawed in that it unjustly imprisons people, and his failure to protest against that at any point in his life would also constitute something that's morally wrong. And then moving on to the conclusion is that Socrates ought to drink the hemlock instead of escaping. If the premises of this logical argument are valid, then this conclusion would logically follow, because if he isn't going to escape, then he automatically has to agree to the punishment. To argue against that, Socrates himself said, quote, "A man who is one of the god's possessions should not kill himself until the god sends some compulsion upon him," end quote. In this situation, Socrates failing to accept the clear-cut opportunity of escape is essentially a suicide. He is choosing to die instead of escape, which is something that he himself said is something that can't be done unless it is the will of the gods, which it is not here. Again, Socrates won't be able to complete his divine mission if he refuses to escape, and refusing to escape essentially will prioritize obedience to the state over obedience to the gods themselves.